Welcome everyone to today's Brown Bag. I am Beth Twiss Houting, and for those of you online, thank you for joining us as well. I do want to say to those of you online, if you have questions at the end, if you'll put them in the Q&A box, I would be happy to answer them at that point when I answer the questions from the floor as well. I want to thank you all for joining me today to learn about the life of Selina Gerhard Schultz. It's a little intimidating, I have to say, to be talking to so many people who in some way are connected with her. But I hope that you will learn something new as we go along. And in fact, the worst use of the word learning in the title was a very conscious choice to indicate that this is not a comprehensive, authoritative biography, but rather sort of a chronological sharing of anecdotes about her life, or what I've learned about her life thus far. My interest in Selina began with this photo. Who is this woman sitting on top of a ladder in a room full of books? Well, as those of you in Schwenkfelder circles know, it's Dr. Selina Gerhard Schultz, the final editor of the Corpus Schwenckfeldianorum. Those few facts alone only piqued my curiosity more, since most photos of such work that time period might look like this. So I wanted to learn about this woman who seemed to move in what might be primarily a male world. What were her motivations? What were her interests? What was she like? In my journey to accomplish this, I have a lot of people to acknowledge, without whom this talk would not be what it is, and I would not have learned so much. First of all, and many of you are here, it was such a joy to speak with her relatives, Carol Gogutz, Robert Schultz and their spouses, Sharon and Claire Ryman, Craig Nash, Lori Brown, and Waldo Johnson, as they shared their memories and photos of Selina with me. Dr. Peter Erb likewise provided me with context into which to put Selina as a Schwenkfeld scholar. Last summer, our intern Emma Adrian did research for me, helping locate secondary sources that was very helpful. And over the last year, Kate Mayberry has become my partner in crime because she just coincidentally began to inventory Selina's 16 boxes of documents at the same time. So we've been able to share back and forth. And then finally, none of this could have happened without Alan V. Meyer, who has been gracious enough to share with me his work on Dr. Elmer Johnson's diaries, as well as just plain answers every single little question that I have, and there are many of them. Without all of these people, this talk would not be possible, but at the same time, I do have to say that all factual errors or conclusions are mine, and I hope I'm not going to offend anybody by being very familiar using first names for Selina and Elmer and that kind of thing. Not only is it easier, but I actually feel like I kind of know them now. So I want to begin the talk sort of at the end, and that is in the memorial service for Selina, Reverend Martha Kriebel said that Selina's life is her sermon. And that got me thinking about what is a sermon. It's a kind of lesson. Often it's an explication of a Bible text. And so what is sort of the lesson we might learn from Selina's life? I think that it has to do, as I see it, with the way in which she combined her devotion to work, family, and God in a very inseparable way. They were all part of one for her. Many people know of her professional work. She was a teacher, secretary, editor, author, academic advisor. In talking to people who knew her, I've learned that she was more often than not serious and quiet in demeanor, but very kind and loving towards family and friends. She held education in the highest regard. She loved her work, but she did have hobbies. I learned that she was a good baker, particularly of Schwenkfelder cake, and today I learned coleslaw. She collected stamps, and she enjoyed doing family genealogy. From reading her letters, I learned more of her concern for others, as well as her exacting nature, her quiet wit, her fears and fearlessness, her deep love of flowers and farming, an interest in interior decoration and clothes, and what I think might have been a love-hate relationship with sewing. With that as a summary, what I'd like to do now is sort of a loose chronology of her life, highlighting certain points that I think speak to these qualities, and also where we can hear her own voice from her letters or in her own words. And because I won't have time to discuss all the things she did, I did make this handout with sort of the major events of her lifetime. And I hope that now you will get to enjoy knowing her as I have. Oops, I forgot to advance the slide at one point. And this little thing is in a way, yes, this is a picture done by Carol Gogatz. Whoops. What I'm trying to do is get this to move. And instead it doesn't want to minimize. Well, we will move along. Selina was born the fifth child of Ambrose and Regina Gerhard on September 16, 1880. And so yes, her birthday is in 2 days. Her family consisted at that point of 2 older sisters and 1 older brother. Now I said she was the fifth child. There was a child, unfortunately, who had died at age 2 before she was born. She, however, became the middle child in her family, as she was followed by 2 brothers and 1 sister. The couple's children spanned 18 years, so that when the youngest was born, Selina was 9 and the oldest was 18. They lived on this farm near Palm at the corner of what is today Route 29 and Water Street, where Knoll is. And the children attended school in Palm. We know from an article Selina wrote later about her mother, Regina, that Regina was very emphatic about the children receiving education and also about knowing their Schwenkfelder heritage. And part of this emphasis on education, I think also we can look at the fact that both Selina's mother and father had some post-high school education. So she comes by it naturally. Recently, we were given this photo of Palm School's class of 1890. And in it, Selina has marked some people. Go over here. I'm going to point them out for you. Right under the laser there is Selina at age 10. And then number 2 is right here. This boy is her brother Atwood. And number 3, this brother is her brother Sam. And then what must have been good friends, because the only 2 other mentioned are this girl here, Ida Meister, and the boy here, Wayne Meister. Oops. Get rid of the pointer too. Selina goes on to Perkiomen Seminary, where she graduates in 1898. She took the classics course, which was considered the college preparatory course, but she did not go on to college. She says in her autobiography that she writes later that her family didn't have the finances to send her at that time. I'm guessing that she was probably always a good student and probably pretty serious about her studies, though it's always fun to find evidence otherwise. For example, in a letter she wrote in November of 1897 to her sister who was living in Princeton, she said, "It is nothing but study, study all the time from morning till night." But then on the next page, it's almost 10 o'clock, and then there's going to be some fun again on the hall. She also mentions that she's planning, quote, "a senior party at home with 10 boys and 8 girls. We will all march up the railroad. They can hardly wait for it." Similarly, later in Germany, she writes a friend, "This is such a beautiful morning that I can hardly sit still. Huh, do you believe that of one so serious and quiet as I?" I do want to go back to her comment about them marching up the railroad tracks, by which she means literally walking on the tracks, because later in a letter that she wrote to her sister Mamie, when she was in Germany and Mamie had just gotten a new job at the Palm Glove Factory. She says, "I hope that you do not go on the railroad at all," by which she means walking. "It is too dangerous. Here in this country, people are fined for walking on it. And the longer I'm here, the more I see how foolish it is to walk on it. When we folks were home 5 years ago, I know that we walked over the trestle at the ice dam, for which we ought to have been spanked. I know that we all went to school on that old railroad and nothing happened to us, but it's too risky. So please stay off." Now, as I said, she could not attend college, so she then went back to Perkiomen Seminary and took their teacher training course, which was a condensed short version, and then began almost a 10-year teaching career in public schools. We think her first assignment was at the Bethesda Schoolhouse, which stands at the corner of Kutztown and Township Woods Roads, and is today a house. During those years, when she was teaching, she was also involved in forming the Ladies' Aid Society at Palm Church in 1898 and was a teacher of the girls' Bible class. She maintained ties with the people in these groups and with these groups themselves, in school, church, and the Perkiomen general community throughout her life, even though she did not live here after 1909, which is when she first moved to Germany to work on the Corpus. So now I'm going to do this very, very short aside about the Corpus to give background. I think probably most of the people in the room know what it is, but I don't know about all the people on Zoom. And certainly I was not familiar with it before I took this job. So I want to give a real quick biography or summary. It begins with this man, Chester Hartraft. In 1884, during the 150th anniversary of the Schwenkfelder landing in Philadelphia, Dr. Chester Hartraft of the Hartford Theological Seminary challenged church members to preserve the history of Schwenkfeld and Schwenkfelderism. The suggestion led to sending him to Germany to recover all of the early documents he could and to produce a book on Schwenkfeld's writing. Interestingly, Selina was at that meeting. Her parents were attending the General Conference meeting in 1884, so she was there as a 4-year-old. Now, by the early 1900s, the church is becoming concerned because they haven't seen a book be published yet. And so they wonder what Hartraft is up to. And they send Elmer Johnson over in 1904 to kind of check up on the situation and act as an associate editor. This whole thing was rather poorly communicated, it seems, to Hartraft, and there were tensions between the men. But Johnson realized how big this job was, how much work there was. And when he was back home here in 1908, the Church Publication Committee decided to create a team to work on this. And so they appoint Selina as one of the members of this team. In this letter of October 16th of 1908, O.S. Kriebel is writing to Selina to inform her that the night before she was, quote, unanimously selected as private secretary and stenographer to the editors of the Corpus Schwenckfeldianorum. Now, there are, of course, when you're studying a historical figure, unanswered questions about her life. And one of them for me was, how did she get chosen? Why her? How did she become involved? Well, in reading Elmer Johnson's diary as well as her letters, it becomes clear that while she was teaching, she was already acting as her brother-in-law, Elmer Johnson is her brother-in-law, as his secretary, and collaborating with O.S. Kriebel at the seminary on getting the Carnegie Library built. As early as 1904, in Elmer's diary, it notes that she is copying materials, probably in the library here, for Dr. Hartraft to use in the Corpus project. So I'm thinking that she was, visible and already somewhat involved in this project. So it made it easy for the Church Publication Board to think of her when the team was to be expanded. On March 2nd, 1909, Selina, who's on the left here, with Elmer and his wife, her sister Agnes, and their 8-year-old son, Roland, embarked for Germany on the TSS Rhythm. Selina is a good writer. If you read her letters or her professional writing. She's very plain, easy to understand, but most of her public writing is very straightforward nonfiction. It's articles about things, it's summaries, it's biographies, that kind of thing. So I was really taken back when I discovered in the Schwenkfeldian a publication of a talk that she gave to the Ladies' Aid Society in 1911, where she talks about herself in the third person as this 29-year-old from rural Pennsylvania who's getting on a ship in New York City to head for Germany. It's probably the most poetic thing I have found in her writing. It's very long, so I'm only going to read you a few parts of it. She begins. It was on a fair morning in early spring. A traveler stood for the first time in her life on the deck of a modern steamer about to sail for a foreign land. The air was crisp and cold. The sun, like a huge ball of fire, had risen over the city by the sea. From 1,000 chimneys, clouds of smoke curled up into the morning air. Tall buildings and towers cast long, dark shadows over the busy harbor where boats of all sizes, kinds, and shapes were hurrying to and fro. That was the steamer leaving, right? Because in fact, I'm going to jump ahead to where the steamer has left, and she says, for a moment it seemed as if all that had been was suddenly buried by the seething waters that marked the trail of the ship, but just ahead lay the future. And then near the conclusion, our passenger had no thought of fear as she looked out about her on board of that floating palace, so strongly built, although its timbers creaked with every rocking motion of the ship and the continuous thud of the engines underneath. You cannot help but be deeply impressed by the majestic beauty on every side, and with the fact that an almighty power has fashioned it all and holds even the deep sea in the hollow of his hand. In my beginning remarks, I mentioned her fearlessness. And one of the ways it comes out is during this first voyage, she was very disappointed that there were never rough seas. But when she goes back to Germany, and we'll talk about her going back a second time, in 1912, it's a different story. And everybody's very seasick at first. She writes to her friend Katie Beeler, "You have probably heard what kind of voyage we had and how ill we all were, so I'll not repeat that part of my story. The part of the trip which I like to think about is the day the waves were as high as our ship, and we plowed through mountains of water and then valleys again. It was glorious. I felt all right by that time, you may know, and could enjoy the waves. I am glad I saw them. Our steamer chairs were tied fast, and as so long as we held on to them, we were safe on deck number 3. Now, part of what I think shores her up on these trips is that she's really very deeply convicted to her work and the high regard that she holds this Corpus project. In various different letters, she described it as something worthwhile, intensely fascinating. I can assure you, I love it exceedingly, speaking of her work to her parents. She explains to a friend, you see, it is a field of Reformation history that has been so neglected and lost sight of that it is a great task to unearth it. They arrived in Germany and they made their home in Wolfenbüttel, where Dr. Hartraft had set up camp due to the town housing Europe's library with the largest Reformation collection. Elmer and Selina worked very hard on the corpus, according to his diary and her letters, often 6 days a week. And I should explain also, this is the library in the middle. Find my pointer here. And this is a postcard that Elmer sent, and he has marked right here that this is the Corpus workshop down in the basement. And then we have a picture of one of the reading rooms, and excuse me, on the far right corner is the house where Dr. Hartraft was staying and had in it what they called the Corpus room. They sort of worked over 3 locations: the library, Hartraft's house, and then the house that they were staying in. So as I say, they were working often 6 days a week. And she says, Corpus work is first, second, and third from 6:30 a.m. to almost any hour in the evening, with a noon intermission for a half an hour walk and dinner, and after that, 20 minutes for rest. Selina early on developed a real affection for Hartraft. When she was writing her brother in 1911, she said that getting to know Dr. Hartraft was the best part of the work. She also says that he reminded her in his manner of their father. And during that first trip, she was very homesick, and so that probably made a big difference there. I think that Hartraft's affection was probably returned. In volumes 2 and 3 of the Corpus, which were the first 2 that she worked on, in her copy, he wrote inscriptions. In volume 3, for instance, he said, "Companionship in the study of a soul like Schwenkfeld's must lead to that unity and fellowship of the spirit, which she claimed to be the foundation in the architectural principles of the Christian structure. Your colleague, Chester Hartraft." When his health was failing, and he did die in 1914, Selina ended up acting as the mediator between Hartraft and Johnson. The 2 men still said some of those tensions I mentioned earlier, but she was the one that could go to Hartraft and explain how they wanted to revise something he did or ease him out of the work as his health was failing. I like this photo because in the diary in particular, Almost Dying, he will talk about Selina working on the machine and the idea of typewriting being something somewhat new-ish. And it's also interesting when she writes letters home, usually they're handwritten, but when they're typewritten, she always apologizes for it seeming not as warm. So despite this joy in the work and affection for the college, Selina, as I said, was homesick in that early period. And one of the things that she writes about when she's getting ready to go home in 1911, just seems so relatable to me. You know, have you been away and when you go home, you tell your mother what you want them to cook for you? Well, she writes her parents and she gives them the menu. She wants lima beans, corn, chicken, tomato sauce, canned peaches, and pickles. It's pretty rare for her to ever, other than the homesickness, which isn't exactly complaining, it's just stating, you know, how she feels. It's pretty rare for her to complain. But there was another interesting letter in 1916 where she does complain. She says that she helps everyone and no one helps her. She says she helps Roland with his lesson. She helps Elmer with the Corpus. She helps Agnes and the girl with the housekeeping, but nobody helps her. Now, it sounds like they're working, but it was not all work. Agnes and Selina joined a local oratorio and participated in putting on concerts. Selina, developed some friendships with some German women that became lifelong friendships. She writes them often after she returns. And the family went sightseeing. In fact, one of the things that Selina was most keen about going to Germany originally was because she knew it would give her a chance, she hoped, to tour the Silesian homelands. At one point in that first trip, she'd come in 1909, there was talk of her returning in 1910, and she was most emphatic that she could not go back yet because she had not accomplished that mission. So on September 24th, 1910, she gets her wish. And as she points out, September 24th was, quote, an auspicious day for a trip to that particular country. And this is a postcard that she has in her collection from that trip to Hartbersdorf. She writes in a letter, "I felt as if I had suddenly been transported into another world. Everything looked so different from anything I'd ever seen before. Those were interesting and impressive days for me. The memory of them will last my lifetime. Now, I've mentioned 2 trips. The group of 4 came back to this country in mid-1911, and there was sort of housekeeping and fundraising to be done on the Corpus at that time. And then they returned to Germany again in January of 1912. And a couple years later, World War I breaks out. At first, they thought that they should return immediately to the US, but then they discovered that if they went, it wasn't likely that they could take with them the books and papers that they had accumulated in this research, and they weren't willing to give that up. And so they decided to stay in Germany in order to safeguard those materials. Now, there are a number of places where one could write a whole nother book about a subject, and one of them is about their time in their life in wartime Germany. Today, I'm just going to pick out a couple experiences to talk about. And I have to say that in general, it was more a matter of inconvenience in their life than hardship. For example, the family had always had a robust garden and grew most of their food. By the time of the war, they were keeping rabbits, goats, and bees. So she makes note that they were not really affected much by the rationing that happened, the food rationing that happened in Germany, other than they couldn't always get flour as often as they wanted or as much meat. At one point, Germany says they are not going to deliver letters to the US that are written in English. Well, this was a family well equipped to switch to German. So, again, it inconvenienced them too much. Speaking of letters, the letters were censored. Towards the end of the war, though, they were having trouble getting letters from the United States. So they developed a system where they went through Switzerland, which you can note on one of those envelopes. And they developed a code. They wanted the censors to think the letter was really only going to Switzerland, but they had a person in Switzerland who actually was then forwarding 2 of them in Germany. And the code was, hand the letter to Selina next time you see her. Trying to make them think that that family was in Switzerland. This is not to say that they weren't affected emotionally by the war. They had German friends who were conscripted, taken prisoner, and even died in the war. Elmer wrote in his diary on August 9th, 1914, near the beginning of the war, for example, that Selina, quote, is in a sad state owing to the fact that Hans is off to war. I never have figured out or have not yet figured out who Hans was. I think he might have been one of Roland's friends. Selina, Agnes, and Elber supported the war effort for putting together care packages, providing refreshments for soldiers, knitting, and attending memorials. What was fascinating to me, actually, was Selina's attitude toward the German war effort. And I say this knowing that, for instance, they were living in Wolfenbüttel, which was not a center of fighting, that she was reading and hearing the German point of view all the time, and that what I'm getting are her letters that were censored. She does occasionally, but not often, express fear. Generally, she's more quick to point out that life in Germany is not as bad as the Allies and the US press make it out to be. And some of her letters were even published in the Allentown Democrat in 1915 to try to make this point. She says, we are comfortable, have all we need in way of clothes, fuel, and food. She blames the US a number of times for sending money and supplies to the Allies. Obviously, this is before the US was in the war itself. As she says, she thought it was prolonging the war. And she even goes on to make some interesting statements, such as this one. I will never esteem my country as I did before these awful things happened. One feels estranged. Something is not right, not as it used to be. And occasionally these come up, almost one could say an anti-American attitude. And as I say, I sometimes wonder how much that has to do with the censoring, but I think she truly was upset by the US approach to the war. Certainly when she returns to the country, she doesn't act like she doesn't support the US. And in fact, her later work talks very much about her esteem and pride for the freedom in this country, in particular, freedom of religion. And she correlates that with Schwenkfeld's theology and also the Schwenkfelder exile in the 1730s. She wrote a biography of Schwenkfeld, and Peter Erb, then later, when it was republished, wrote a preface to it. And in that, he, for instance, says that Selina saw a direct line from Schwenkfeld's teaching to American democracy, as she saw Schwenkfeld, quote, as a genuine champion of religious liberty. Her support for this point of view is also found in the late 1940s and early 50s when she joins an organization called Protestant and Other Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And this was a group that was largely reacting to government money being spent for Catholic schools. But its main emphasis, and this group is around with a different name today, is on the separation of church and state, and that as a sign of religious freedom. So the war ends, and it gets to the point where US citizens may leave the country with a lot of bureaucracy and many, many delays. Finally, on March 15th, finally in March 1919, they have the Corpus packed and ready to go. And the original photo is not a very clear photo, so I apologize for that here. There were 138 boxes, 12 tons, what filled 2 boxcars in Germany, but as Roland later wrote about the experience, he said it was only 1 boxcar here because our boxcars are bigger. The final exasperation with all this bureaucracy was on March 15th, 1919, when they were getting ready to board the ship home. And the Dutch officials would allow Elmer, Agnes, and Roland to get on the ship and not Selina. And they said this was, quote, she was still subject to further clarification. Well, Elmer went to bat, and it was arranged she could come home with them. So now we come to what's another big mystery for me. So she gets home on April 11th, 1919, and she gets married on December 27th, 1919. So I thought, oh, they're going to be letters, courtship letters, something. No, there's nothing in the files about it. So I'm like, where did this romance come from? I know, you all know, that she knew her husband all his life. There's this great story that when she was 4, a lot of things happened when she was 4, that when she was 4, she was at a neighboring farm and that she saw the crying baby who was Eugene. She was also Eugene's teacher when he was in 8th grade at the Bethesda school. The Rymans told me that they thought that there was an agreement between Eugene and Selina. He wanted to get married, and she said not until the Corpus is done, which he's really lucky that she didn't really wait for that. 1961, broke down a little earlier. So I was kind of digging to see what else I could find. And I think if there was a promise, that it was probably made in 1911 when she was home between trips. Elmer, in his diary, often recorded what letters the household received and what letters they wrote. Now, I don't know that it's completely 100% accurate, but before the first trip, before 1911, there's only 1 letter between that couple. And after, there are more, not a lot, but like a dozen over a period of years, but more. However, I came across this really funny exchange of letters. And so you can see what you think. O.S. Kriebel in 1913 writes to Selina, Professor Breck jokingly remarked yesterday at the meeting of the Board of Publication that the board ought to see to it that I can't say her name, Gerhard, that's only tripling, I need a drink of water, Gerhard would not get married. I asked him, how would you go about preventing such a desperate calamity? He jokingly replied that the danger would be that some attractive count might come along and play havoc with the assistant editor. I assured him, so far as I could see, there was no danger from that source. And as long as we kept the assistant editor away from the right sort of young people in this country, that she would probably be totally secure and safe. Well, Selina responds in a letter that also has other business in it. This here. As to Professor Brecht's anxiety about a European count robbing the board of my services, I can assure you that there is no danger in the least. If any such person shows himself here, he will be put to work at once. And besides, he might be in serious danger of having his pockets emptied for the benefit of the corpus. So you can see for yourself that there is ample safeguard on this side. On the other hand, I fear the board would be powerless in warding off every entangling alliance, in spite of a still greater increase in salary. Eugene comes across as being an amazing person. Certainly from talking to many of you, that is true. But also just from looking at this historically, not only did he wait for her, but he supported her work on the corpus throughout their lives. Her grandchildren told me that he made it clear to them that she did the important work. He, however, was also well known in his own field. He was a research scientist for the US Department of Agriculture. With a doctorate in cytology of plants from Colombia, he had a 54-year career studying potato disease. In 1949, he was made an honorary member of the Potato Association of America. Eugene seems to me to be the yin to Selina's yang. He was down to earth, he kept his Dutchy accent when she did not, he was a prankster, and he was always ready for fun. For example, on August 11th, 1926, Selina writes to her sister one night how she's so tired and he is working late and hasn't come home, and so she's just gonna go to bed. But then he comes in and he says they need to have a party. He has brought ice cream with him. So she gets up and obliges him, though she says she really didn't want any ice cream, but she, wanted to be kind. In a letter that she writes her mother 3 months after their wedding, she describes in great detail how their apartment in Washington, D.C. is set up. I should say Eugene was working in Washington, D.C. for the US Department of Agriculture when they got married, and so immediately they moved there. And then she concludes the letter with, "Now, Mother, I suppose I need not add that we're getting along beautifully and happily and are having the time of our lives after the long years of patient, faithful waiting. We are in it to make the most of it, and I think we are succeeding very well." Yeah, very sweet. Clearly, they supported each other. I kind of begin to think of them as the Schwenkfelder power couple of their day. They lived, however, a very nomadic life. As I said, there was Washington, D.C., and that's where they continued to spend winters or school years when they had children. They lived for a short time also in Yonkers, New York, but every summer, Eugene was in Maine where his test fields were. And Selina and the children would come here. And then occasionally, she would go visit Eugene for a few weeks. Sometimes the children went with her, but often they stayed here the whole summer with the families. The publication board worried, not first about her getting married, then they worried about her having children. They were always worried that she was going to give up working on the corpus as her personal life circumstances changed, but they really shouldn't have worried. She was always committed. And one thing she always did was she would describe her offices and how they were laid out to her parents or her sister when she was writing letters. And I have to say, I just got these two pictures this morning. I'm so excited of her offices. And in the one in 1920, we have a letter where she writes that they were set, this was right after they were first married, so it's her first trip up to Maine, and she's setting up office, and that he goes and brings home furniture from the US Department of Agriculture to create an office for her in their house. She also talks when she gets to Palm about making use of furniture in the house to create her office. She's always talking about how she's setting up her office. And in while she was here in Palm in the summers, she tried to get to the Schwenkfelder Library every day. Martha Kriebel in her memorial also talked about her getting up at 4:30 in the morning to do work before her family was up. So she was incredibly committed. Now, in the handout that I gave you, you can see that she gets promoted through her time from being a secretary to finally being the editor-in-chief. In fact, Elmer advocated to Hartraft for volume 2, the first one that she mentioned, that she get some accommodation or commendation because she wasn't, they weren't going to put secretary on the title page. And so Hartraft does mention her in the preface. After that, you can follow her progressions by looking at the title pages of the different volumes. Alan and I have been trying to find formal promotions for her, but we cannot find any time when like the Board of Publications said, now she's an associate editor, for instance, that kind of thing. But it is very clear that she is the guiding force behind the corpus once the team comes back from Germany in 1919. Another sort of anecdote I like to share here is the way in which her personal and work life came together, because it reminds me so much of being a working mother today. On January 30th in 1922, when Selina was 42, she had her first child, Eugene Arden. And in early 1928, the three of them are moving from Washington, D.C. to Yonkers. But she's very worried, this is already in the spring, because Eugene will be leaving soon for Maine. And she's writing in her letters how tired she is. Now, throughout her life, she actually wasn't the healthiest of people. She even had her tonsils removed while she was in Germany. But she's also saying their son isn't feeling well either, so she's feeling overwhelmed. And on May 3rd, 1928, she writes to her sister-in-law, Daisy, the evil day has come, meaning he has left. Remember that date, May 3rd. On May 14th, there is a letter from Eugene, and he does not have as good handwriting as she. Congratulations for you, Selina, for having safely come through your ordeal and realized your several wishes. For Eugene Arden, for realizing his wishes, and for Elma, for an excellent mother and a very good brother, and for arriving in a world with unbounding opportunities. This is my happiest birthday. She gave birth. She was tired because she was 48 years old and pregnant. And her husband was in Maine. And yes, Elma was born on Eugene's birthday. A peek into Selina's wit is that she let Eugene know by sending him a telegraph that came from Elma. Now, that spring of 1928 went on to include the death of her mother, Regina. And this event caused much consternation in trying to figure out childcare, because of course Selina wanted to come to the funeral. Eventually, she arranged for a nurse to come take care of 1-month-old Elma in Yonkers for the day. And on June 10th, she and her 6-year-old got on the train in Yonkers, came down to Allentown where they were picked up, attended the funeral, and went back home. 11 days after that, Eugene Arden is in the hospital having his tonsils removed. So it is with much relief by July that Selma and the children arrive in Palm to spend the summer with their family. During that time, she takes the bus almost every day to Pennsburg to the library. Her work life is full throughout the decades of their time back in this country with editing the final volumes of the corpus. This includes navigating working with the U.S. War Claims Office over volumes lost during World War II bombing, and that's a whole nother story. She's keeping the Schwenkfelder history front and center within the church through publishing, particularly articles in the Schwenkfeldian, but also co-editing with her brother, the Schwenkfeldianism, and planning Day of Remembrance programs. She keeps alive, or actually, I would almost say creates, an international network of scholars who are working on Schwenkfelder history. And the final volume of the corpus, number 19, is published under her editorship in June of 1961. The front page of that includes a statement from the Board of Publication as a tribute to Selina. We would be remiss, however, were we not to record here our profound gratitude, our respect, and our affection for Selina Gerhard Schultz. While many lives were deeply touched by the Corpus Schwenckfeldianorum, in a very real sense, it can be said of her that she put her life into the corpus. There can be no question that without her deep devotion to the cause, the corpus would never have been completed. Indeed, it is doubtful if more than the first few volumes would have appeared in print. For the past 53 years, Selina G. Schultz has labored each day, quietly, modestly, efficiently, and intelligently in the interests of this publication. A scholar among scholars, her intellectual honesty never wavered from the pursuit of truth, never accepted that which was only partially correct. And that never accepting error comes true in many ways. In her second volume of the Corpus, she has handwritten in the errors in the published version. Another personal reward for her for all the years of shipping boxes of manuscripts hither and yon was the receipt of an honorary doctorate. The activities relating to this episode in her life speak to great changes in communication and transportation over the century, as well as the relationship between Selina and Eugene. On July 31st, 1961, Andrew Berkey, who was the director of the Schwenkfelder Library at the time, wrote to Selina to announce that she was to receive an honorary doctorate from the Evangelical Theological Faculty of the University of Tübingen in West Germany. Selina had advised some students there on Schwenkfelder research. Berkey wrote of his concern for her at 81 years old. I realize the prospect of such a trip may be a heavy undertaking for you, but we urge you to give it every consideration. She takes a week to answer him in writing, and I'm thinking there were telephones. And she says to him, your message of July 31, received on the 3rd, shattered my equilibrium, as you may surmise. While I deeply appreciate the offer of an honorary degree from Tübingen University, to make the journey thither at my age seems an ordeal. And then she goes on to mention that she is going to write her husband, to consult with him, write him. He's in Maine, she's in DC, and that it could probably take a week turnaround. Well, Eugene writes immediately back, like the day he gets the letter on August 7th, and he says that that letter from Andy Berkey is capital news and makes me feel like jumping 6 feet up and clicking my heels. No degree was ever conferred on a more deserving person than yourself. By all means go, and no ifs, ands, or buts about it accepted. Yes, and I'm planning to go, for I want to go too. The trip was arranged by Berkey for the three of them. And Selina, who had been so fearless in traveling those seas, is actually apprehensive about flying. Nonetheless, she goes, she delivers her acceptance speech in German, along with providing an autobiographical sketch of herself. After 1961, it seems that she may have slowed down with some of her church committee work. But however, during that period, she wrote, tested out, and published a course of study to educate Schwenkfelders about Schwenkfeld and the history of their faith. And in her letters, we know she continues to consult with scholars throughout Europe and continues to be exacting in her edits of them. In the late 1960s, Eugene and Selina moved to an apartment in Paoli, near where Eugene Arden lived. Eugene Sr.'s health was failing, but retired, they enjoy their family, and Selina occasionally visits Hensburg. And this picture, her family thinks, was taken in early 1969 on the steps in front of our building. On July 19th of that year, Selina died, and Eugene shortly after, on October 23rd. And so with this, we return to where we began this afternoon. Her sermon is her life. On the gravestone in Palm Cemetery, you will see that there's a Bible verse cited for each of them. Eugene's is a short one, Mark 16, verse 15. And he said unto them, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Selina's is much longer, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to close with the ending portion of it. It's Proverbs 31, and I'll read verses 25 to 31, because when I talked about her life as her sermon, and a sermon being can be an explication of a Bible verse, it seems like it really comes together here. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children arise and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Honor her for all that her hands have done, and let her works bring her praise at the city gate. I want to thank you for going with me on this journey today. There is so much more that I could say, but so much more I could learn. And so I'm happy to hear any stories that you have. I do want to point out that we have 2 cases here with materials from our museum and library collections related to Selina for you to take a gander at today. But also we have a surprise during the Q&A session. Because it is 2 days until her 142nd birthday, we have Schwenkfelder cake. And I want to thank, and coffee, Joanne Jalawe, Sarah Hefner, and Diane Berg, our baker, for helping provide this cake for us so that we can celebrate Selina in due style. And so with that, if there are any questions. We have somebody joining us from Houting, Germany, it says.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Any questions, any comments or remembrances? Yes.
I have 2 comments. First of all, I want to thank you. That's terrific.
Okay.
I was so Selina was an extremely interesting person. I barely knew it. Or whatever. But you really brought our lives, and I think it's terrific.
Well, good.
Thank you.
Hopefully accurately.
Other question I had, and it has to do with, you sort of maybe answered the question, it has to do with the German and the German language. I come, even though my name is Twiss, and that's Welsh. On my mother's side, my sheep is German. I married a wife who was purely German, so I got lots of German influence. And I know that they retain their German language and use it frequently. And I'm just assuming that she already knew German. She didn't really have to pick it up anywhere. She probably knew just growing up German was probably common in her household.
Well, certainly there was Pennsylvania German spoken, which isn't quite the same. Right. But in the classical course that she took at the Perkiomen Seminary, they also were formally taught German, Latin, and Greek. Yeah. Anything else?
Oh, you're asking what cemetery? That's in.
Oh, yes. Selina is buried in the Palm Cemetery.
Yep. I love that letter from my grandfather Schultz. That was great.
Which one? The one about the,
Yeah, at the end.
at the end about going to Germany?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, always up for an adventure.
That's great.
One of the things that's in the case from that trip is that she saved the folder that the plane ticket was in. And it's really a neat 1960s design. But she was very obviously impressed by that whole trip. So we have lots of that kind of material that she saved. Well, why don't we become much more informal? I thank those of you who joined us online. For those, and unfortunately you missed the cake. For those of you here, feel free to come have cake and coffee and take a look and share memories.
There's decaf, regular, and there's 20 cheap.